that, I think that it cuts right across our kind of tendency to a Platonic universe where everything is spirit or flesh matter, and kind of this dualism that occurs. And then we pretty much do charitable things to out of compassion, but ultimately for some sort of heavenly reward, rather than seeing kind of a redemption for everything, or a reconciling effect on the whole universe, over societies, over our communities. I remember, not to go off track, but I remember sitting in a conference once, and for the first time, someone from India was speaking on Jesus' incarnation, and was speaking of it as the way he incarnated poverty, the way that Jesus himself was poor. And I had never really thought, it never occurred to me that Jesus was poor. He wasn't middle class. He wasn't, suburban. He was what ancient poverty looked like. And
Right.
so I wonder, is there a role in which um, the incarnation, the church has an obligation or duty to kind of, as you're saying, be alongside or be with, or is it just that we need to respond? What is the level of incarnational response that is obligated of the faith, in a sense, I guess, is the question I'm kind of drawing.
So, for decades, people would hear and talk about how 80% of the work that is done in a church is done by 20% of the people, and maybe that number is close to 90-10 today. I don't know. I have noticed that Orthodox churches are not exempt from the same type of proclivity as any other church in the United States, where once a community reaches a certain level of wealth, they might pack up from their original location if it's in a poorer area, and then move somewhere where it's a little bit more affluent. That happens. I acknowledge that, and that happens across the board within Christianity. I applaud the churches who are willing to stay in some of their original locations where there is the greatest need. But to answer your question, to what degree do we get involved? To what degree do we commit to incarnational living? Well, I think in one sense that is a profoundly personal question, because what it requires of a person who is reflecting on this idea is, how much do you believe in the incarnation? Mm-hmm. Like, how important is that? Do you believe that there was ultimately a goal, a purpose for God to come to earth in order to sanctify the entire world? And what was that purpose? And what do we do with that? I think about, to kind of touch on something you just mentioned a few minutes ago, a lot of times people might engage charity because they think, well, this is a compassionate thing to do, or ultimately I'll receive a reward in heaven, and so I need to tick the box. Let's think about our world as a human being, or any kind of organism, but if we envision our world as a human being, and each person is a cell, and these cells operate differently, and they exist in different parts of the body, and many of the cells are sick. Maybe even close to 40%, half, whatever it is. But all these cells within the body are ill and need to be repaired. It is up to the well cells, the white blood cells, or whatever, the cells that repair the other ones who are sick, to help repair those that are ill. And the reason for that is for the functionality of the entire body. I'm not trying to diminish the spiritual side of this, because I don't want to ultimately break this down to a utilitarian approach where it's like, oh, well, it only makes sense in order for us as a human race, or as people of Earth, to progress into the next generation. We have to look out for each other. That's one part of it, and it's a significant part of it, but that's not the only part of it. But there is something to be said that if we believe what we do, or what we claim about Christ's goal, his purpose, his reason for being here, then it only makes sense that we would take on that same level, excuse me, of responsibility. I say all that to say, it really does require a person to look reflectively on just how seriously they understand the incarnation of Jesus Christ. How seriously do they take their faith? I've heard people talk about how they wanted to engage in ministry, and whatever that means. It could look like different things to different people, and we all have different gifts that we are required to steward, per Matthew 25. But I don't think that we should ever get away from the idea that the most vulnerable members of our society require more love. They require more attention. They deserve more love and attention. Their need is their merit. Full stop. Like, just by their own need alone, that is all that is required of a person to receive service, to have somebody come alongside them and work with them. Their journey towards theosis, their journey of sanctification, is our own. I think we have a tendency, perhaps necessarily so, to look at things in a very individualistic manner. We think that we have our own problems and we got to sort those out. And until we can put the oxygen mask on our own face, we can't help the person beside us. I get it. But I also understand that we are not in this alone. And I know that if I'm in a position where I require help, and I have been many times, I want somebody who is willing to come alongside and work with me and treat me with dignity. And that's actually something that was more difficult for me to grasp than the actual service itself.
Yeah.
We have to be cheerful receivers as much as we do cheerful givers. And I don't want to suggest that this is some sort of transaction or equally reciprocal relationship. Sometimes there is much more than we receive than we can give at a particular moment, and that's okay. Because there may come a time down the line where we are able to, based on the stewardship of our gifts, be able to bless somebody else in a way that they may not have been able to do for me as well. Does that make sense?
I think so. I want to touch on you mentioned dignity, and that's something that as reading the Fathers, the idea that somehow Christ restores the nature of human dignity in the incarnation. What does it mean to dignify or to treat people with dignity, or is restoring someone's, the word dignity has that kind of noble Victorian age connotation. So maybe you could elucidate some of what we mean by granting or restoring or dignifying or treating people with dignity, and how that relates, why it's not maybe just enough to feed people or give. I don't know.
Well, I don't think that we have the power to grant anyone dignity.
Mm-hmm.
I think that we have the responsibility to recognize the inherent dignity in each person. And what essentially that can look like is acknowledging that the person beside you, your neighbor, we're told to, like the apostles, we're told to go into Jerusalem, Judea, and all of Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. So we could look at somebody in our own family, that's our Jerusalem. Somebody in our community, that's Judea. But who is our Samaria? That could be somebody who is not like us, somebody who is from a different part of the region or country or world, somebody who is a different faith, somebody of a different socioeconomic background, maybe somebody on the other side of the law. I don't know. Ultimately, those external trappings of what society likes to use in order to define a person or smooth out the edges so we can understand them and compartmentalize them and put them in these neat little boxes so we can say, okay, you behave like this, so you go over there. I behave like this, so I stay over here. That is an incomplete approach, because what it doesn't recognize, what it doesn't take seriously, is the incarnation. If we understand that Christ came into this world to illumine all of creation and sanctify all of creation, we have to tap into that. We have to look around and say, well, that means the person of a different religion than I practice is just as worthy of love and compassion and understanding as my friend who sits next to me in the pew every Sunday. We should not make a distinction. Christ didn't discriminate who he served, and we shouldn't either. I mean, Christ served the Samaritan at the well, the woman at the well, Fotini, and that was somebody who he probably in that society during that time in first century Palestine probably shouldn't have associated with. He did, and I mean, I've encountered folks who, you know, don't feel comfortable going into inner city Harlem because they're like, oh no, it's too scary. I don't feel like I can connect, and I don't really like what goes on there because there are drug dealers and people who engage in trafficking and all sorts of things that we would consider on the seedy underbelly of society. And at the same time, it shouldn't matter. It doesn't matter, because that person bears just as much of the image of God as we do.
Yeah.
And the only way that we can accept that is if we take seriously what Christ came to do, which is sanctify the world.
Yeah. I think there's a tendency to, I think all of us can agree, we all generally agree that God made us all in his image, and there's something special, and whatever that might mean is another whole theology on tap, the image of God itself. But there are some traditions where in the place of sin, the place of kind of a depraved perspective, tends to say that we are broken images, or at best corrupted images of that. And what has been interesting as I've read through some of the stuff we're talking about, or kind of come to that same place, is the incarnation is the way in which our own human nature, the image of God, is restored. And there's something powerful in the way that what Jesus does, that how God therefore says his value of human life, and not just our soul, but our actual life itself, by sharing that same life. What do you say? I think there's a lot of people who have a very negative view of people as a whole. They don't like themselves.
Mm-hmm.
They don't like people. They don't like certain groups of people, or just have a very suspicious perspective towards,
Sure.
you know, untrusting people. Disappoint us. Families are broken, dysfunctional. Might come from places where we've been taught to hate a whole group of people.
Sure.
What does it mean that God likes us, or chose to, in some way, value us in the level of his own son? How do we translate that thought to like practice or life, or what does that mean for us when we see people or see ourselves?
So I think that, you know, we could touch upon this in a kind of psychological way or a spiritual way. I think they're connected. I don't subscribe to the idea that God creates broken people. I don't believe that God creates anything that isn't good. I think that as part of the human condition, we can make choices that ultimately harm our souls or our bodies or our communities. And sometimes we make those choices without complete agency. And what I mean by that is we are, as much agency as we have over the decisions we make, we can't ignore the fact that there are external circumstances that play into our formation. And that starts, you know, as early as childhood and continues up through adulthood. You've probably had conversations with people who haven't gotten over that first initial hump of growth where they see a difference. They recognize that the difference of me versus us isn't an important one. And so it's difficult for them to see that the distinction between us versus them also is not important. But that first step is necessary. If you see an inherent difference between me versus us, you're going to look at people differently. You're going to look at people who don't think the same way you do and say, they should behave like me. Why don't they? There's something inherently wrong with them. There's something inherently broken with their thinking. And then when you extend that to, say you get past that stage and you're like, oh, I found my community. Our community is the right way of doing things. But all these other communities who don't do things the way we do, they are wrong. They're broken. And what that essentially does is put us in a position to be exclusive and say, there are some people who are just inherently less valuable because they don't share our values and they don't require our dignification or service or whatever. I don't think this is correct. I believe that everything that God creates is good. And I want to introduce you really quick to somebody who is really good. This is Demetria. She just came into the room. Demetria, say hi to everybody in China.
Hi, China.
Oh, she's adorable.
Thank you. All right. Can I have a kiss? All right. You go play, okay? Yes, sweetheart. Ask Mama.
No, Mommy was listen.
Okay. I'm going to continue talking, but I have to help Demetria with her dress. This is my life right now. I have become a homeschool teacher's assistant, and things get disrupted every day. So I apologize. Bear with me. This is my new normal.
This is good. This is like a incarnational life on another level.
That's exactly right. And you know what? I wish I prepared better by locking my door, but I have to be responsive and attend to the needs that are in front of me.